So when Ryan and I were down in Chile to visit Grace over Thanksgiving, one of our little excursions that her host family arranged for was to a beach that was a couple hours north. And when we were, I mean, it was too cold to actually swim for me anyway, because I'm kind of wussy, but it was really beautiful and sunny. And I could see in the main beach area, kind of off in the distance, there were these huge birds, and I realized they were pelicans, and I was frustrated because I didn't have my binoculars and they were pretty far away, but they looked so cool. And then when we were heading home, I had to go to the bathroom, so we stopped at kind of the next little beach place up so I could find a bathroom. There was a market there, and I got to the end of one of the like rows of stalls and was going to turn around to go up the next row, and like right there, 15 feet in front of me was a dozen pelicans just sitting on the rocks there. I mean, they are the most awkward, funny, cool birds. I just love them. And, I could have been looking for them all day and never found them, but they were just like right there in this weird little place. Um, Several years ago, I don't even know why I did this, but I decided for my birthday, I wanted to find the best sweet potato fries in Kansas City. So I did all of this internet research, and I got to this, I came up with this place called The Brick. I don't know, Jude and Sharon, if you've been there, but I took my girls, and they were junior high and high school at the time, probably. And honestly, they thought it was a pretty sketchy place, this little hole in the wall place in Kansas City. And I mean, the food there is pretty cheap. You get hamburgers for less than $10. It's not like a high class place, but they have very, very good sweet potato fries. And coincidentally, also on my birthday, several years ago, I think back in 2007, Joshua Bell, who's this world famous violinist, child prodigy, you may have heard of this little experiment, but Joshua Bell went and played his 1713 Stradivarius violin. I don't even want to think about how many millions of dollars that is worth, down to the metro, the DC Metro, and he just played with his case open there in the metro station for like 45 minutes. And out of the 1,097 people who were streaming back and forth during rush hour on the metro, 7 people stopped to listen to Joshua Bell play the violin. And in his violin case at the end of the 45 minutes, there was $52.12. I mean, tickets to see this guy at Carnegie Hall cost $100 a pop, and he sold the place out. But he made $52 from the 1,000 of people that streamed past on the metro that morning. Sometimes good things, beautiful things, life-giving things are found in the less than obvious places, right? That's what the Magi learned when they followed their star to find the King of the Jews. And I'm endlessly fascinated by this story. One of the complaints that preachers have sometimes is these annual stories, and we have to preach every year, and what do you say? But I have to say, I could probably preach Epiphany 2 or 3 times a year. It is just such an interesting and rich story. And I have always been inspired by the dedication of the Magi, right? To watch the sky, to notice this one star, and to recognize that star among the thousands that were in the night sky, and then to follow it, to leave the comforts of their presumably luxurious homes and trek across the desert. I have long admired the attentiveness and the adventurous spirit of the Magi. And yet, in morning prayer this week, my friend, Reverend Carol Rose, she pointed out that the Magi didn't quite get it right. They followed the star for a long distance, for hundreds of miles on foot and or camel. But then once they saw that it was in the general vicinity of Jerusalem, they quit paying such close attention. They just assumed that a king would be born in the capital city. They just assumed that the king would be in the palace because it makes sense, right? In the time of King Herod, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, Magi from the east came to Jerusalem, asking, "Where is the child who has been born King of the Jews? For we observed his star in the east and have come to pay him homage." I always read that part of the story as the Magi are stopping to ask directions. They've been following the star and then they're a little bit uncertain. And so they stop to ask the king where the new king is. It's actually a silly assumption. It doesn't make any sense why they would do that. What makes more sense, and what Carol's comment made me think, is that they probably stopped at the palace not to ask directions, but because that's where they thought the king was. They went to the expected, obvious place, which wasn't quite where the star was, but close enough. It's about 6 miles away, Bethlehem to Jerusalem. They went to the obvious place, but Jesus was not where they expected. At some point on the journey, they quit paying such close attention to the star, to where God was leading, and they just went with their own worldly assumptions about where a king would be. And spoiler alert, in case you haven't read Matthew, it didn't turn out well, right? It caused unnecessary delay. They had to go home by another way, a longer journey, and it also caused a lot of suffering for the people because they had alerted King Herod to the presence of this other king. It's a new way for me to think about this story, that the Magi were expecting Jesus to be in the palace. And I've been wondering how often we do this. How often do we follow God to a certain extent, and maybe even a great extent, but then stop at what seems like the logical, reasonable place, even though the star is traveling just a little bit farther? I don't think it's a coincidence that the shepherds get to Jesus before the Magi. I mean, geographically speaking, of course, they were closer and they get there first. But it's also true that the shepherds didn't have the option of going to the palace. Right? There's no way they would have let these raggedy, smelly shepherds into the palace, let alone to actually talk to King Herod. It's the wealth and the status of the Magi that even give them the opportunity or the possibility of going to the palace and talking to the king. Sometimes our privilege can lead us astray, can make us have assumptions, can let us stop sooner than maybe we should. And sometimes if we keep our hearts and minds and spirits open, we can let go of these assumptions that we carry, these assumptions that our privilege brings to us, and we can follow the star to where it actually rests over the good and beautiful and life-giving thing in the less than obvious place. Sometimes we turn the corner and see the gloriously awkward pelicans gathered right there on the rocks. Sometimes we venture into the sketchy restaurant and eat the best sweet potato fries. Sometimes we are one of the 7 people who notice just how magnificent the background music in the subway station is. Sometimes we follow the star a little bit beyond where we're comfortable, a little bit beyond where we expect it to lead, all the way to Bethlehem, to the good and beautiful and life-giving child, Jesus, who has an eternal tendency of showing up where he is least expected and most needed. Thanks be to God.